welcome to the Better Yourself podcast. Thanks for tuning in today. I'm your host, Ashley Meckling, and today I'm going to explain what this podcast is going to be all about. This podcast is going to be all about mental health, what it is, what it creates, what it can cause, and tips and techniques on how to maintain a positive mental health, as well as physical resources, places, and people that can help. Plus, every few episodes, I'm going to do some positive affirmations and explain my own mental health journey along the way. Now, before we get started, let me introduce myself. I have struggled with mental health since I was about 11 years old, but over the last 2 years is when my mental health really took a dive. I struggled with very severe anxiety, as well as some complex PTSD and undiagnosed OCD and ADHD, which of course did not help things. But through this journey, I have learned so much about mental health, from really not only understanding what it is, but how it affects you both physically and mentally, but also millions of resources, techniques to use, people and places that provide help, and so much more. So, with all of that being said, I've decided to create this podcast as a way to kind of pay it forward so that others can hopefully learn and use this as a way to benefit themselves. But before we dive into the medical side of things, I do want to clarify that I have never received any medical education and that everything I discuss is information that I've received from various psychologists and psychiatrists, as well as information from reading mental health books and relative research on the internet. So, now that we've covered the basics, let's dive right into mental health. Now, this is a very broad term that many people can attribute to a list of millions of different things. But what exactly is mental health? Well, for starters, the brain is divided into 4 interconnected areas: the brainstem, the diencephalon, the limbic area, and the cortex. Your cortex is what's responsible for things like creativity, thinking, language, values, time, and hope, whereas the limbic area is responsible for your reward system, your memory, bonding with others, and your emotions. The diencephalon, which is considered the middle part of the brain, is responsible for your sleep, your appetite, and the movement of your body. And finally, the brainstem, which is responsible for the temperature of your body, your respiration, and your cardiac functioning. Now, I'm sure you're wondering to yourself, why is she talking about parts of the brain? Well, when we receive input from the outside world, it enters our brains from the bottom of the brain, starting at the brainstem, flowing up through the diencephalon, up through the limbic area, and up to your cortex, which is what is known as the thinking part of your brain. Now, if you're stressed, angry, or frustrated, whether it's maybe from a hard day at work, or if you're having a panic attack from a traumatic event, the brain short circuits and prevents the information that you're taking in from the world around you from making it all the way from the brainstem to your cortex, which is responsible for the thinking part of your brain. Now, I know we've all experienced a really bad day at work, and when we're stressed or frustrated and a coworker comes to talk to us, we maybe snap at them or speak to them in a harsh tone that they maybe don't deserve, leaving you feeling instantly guilty. I know I have. Well, this is where deep breathing and calming techniques come into play to maintain a healthy and happy mental health. If you're exposed to stressors like work or a traumatic event, the brain will release excess levels of what's called cortisol, which is known as your stress hormone, which triggers our fight, flight, or freeze response. And if we aren't practicing regulating and calming techniques to maintain a happy and healthy mental health, then we're going to constantly be short-circuiting our brain from understanding proper information. So, to put it simply, you need to continuously be practicing healthy techniques to keep your brain happy and properly functioning. So, to help it thoroughly process information and create a good, positive mental health for yourself. This way, we're not snapping at our coworkers. But, this sounds simple enough, right? Well, when you're dealt with day-to-day problems, whether it's from work, maybe some drama with a friend or a family member, or if you've recently experienced a traumatic event, it's easy to get caught up in our frustration or disappointment, maybe some anxiety or depression, which is where this podcast comes in handy. Throughout the various episodes I share, like I mentioned earlier, I will continuously discuss various techniques, tips, and tricks to help combat day-to-day anxieties, depressive episodes, and stressors, as well as explaining the medical side of how our bodies and brains work together to understand mental health. Some of the topics I will be discussing are anxiety, depression, PTSD, and complex PTSD. Yes, those are two very different things, as well as trauma and triggers, OCD, cognitive disorders, setting boundaries, and so much more as I discuss maintaining our mental health. Plus, like I mentioned earlier, every few episodes, I will dedicate one single episode specifically for guided affirmations, which are a great tool to use to start off each day on the right foot and set yourself up for success. So, to conclude this episode, I will leave you with a technique to use the next time you're in an anxious or stressful situation. It's called the 5 senses technique. First, you look around the room for 5 things you can identify. Then take a deep breath. Next, identify 4 things you can feel. And take a deep breath. Then, identify 3 things you can hear. And take a deep breath. Next, identify 2 things you can smell. And take a deep breath. And finally, identify 1 thing you can taste, and take a deep breath. Let go of the stress and anxiety and take a moment to ground yourself. Take some time to practice this technique today so you are prepared to use it in your next anxious or stressful situation. Also, don't forget you can always call 988, which is the National Suicide Prevention and Crisis Hotline, if you're ever having a mental health episode and need to speak to someone immediately. And feel free to give this podcast a follow on Instagram at Better Yourself Podcast. Thanks for tuning in and listening to my podcast today. I hope you guys tune in again next week, for I will be releasing a new episode every Thursday. See you guys later.